Hi, I'm Susan Clarke, and I am a consultant and a coach, and I work with leaders and teams to help them deal more effectively with conflict. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about my memoir, Crazy, Cracked, Warm, and Deep, and how that applies to leadership. I'm going to actually talk to you about how tapping into your crazy may be a way of tapping into your genius. And also why the word intimacy brings up so much fear and concern in life and in the workplace, and how embracing that may be something that's really valuable and important to overcome.
Welcome back to our delicious conversation with Susan Clarke. She is the author of a brand new book called Crazy, Cracked, Warm, and Deep. It's an unusual title. It's particularly for somebody in the leadership space, but it is a phenomenal book, and I highly recommend it to you. In part one of this delicious conversation, we talked about these fractured parts of ourselves that get pushed to the side, and how oftentimes it is the quote worst moments that bring us back together. These moments that seem like they should be endings are actually very often beginnings. I understand that they don't feel like that at the time. Remember, I've been through a few of them myself. But when you get to look back, you realize that this was a wonderful opportunity for you. And we talked about in the first part how it's easy to see yourself as broken or fractured in some way, and that your path to wholeness is actually in bringing these pieces together. We talked about how sometimes the very thing you're working in is the actual weakness, and the very thing you deny is your greatest strength. And that sometimes, particularly in the world of business and leadership, there is a resistance to embracing those parts of yourself that you've maybe seen as being a bit cracked or a bit crazy, or maybe too warm for business and definitely too deep for business. But what if that's actually the path? And that's a lot of what we talked about in part one of the show. We're going to dive deeper into all that, of course, into part two of the show. Where I want to start here is, there was a word you mentioned earlier that I think is a word that is misunderstood and avoided desperately in the world of business. Now we throw around this word passion. Oh, where's your passion? What's your passion? But I can remember in the 90s, you couldn't say that word because it had a sexual connotation. Now, it doesn't. I mean, that's obviously, there's more to passion than sex. And the word that you used here that I think is also grossly misunderstood, which is this word intimacy. We think of intimacy again as being sexual, but it's not. You talked about it being into me see. Talk to us about why you think business is so avoidant of this word intimacy, and why it's so important for us to embrace it in our leadership.
Well, I mean, one, I think, intimacy, I love that you brought up the word passion, because it's now got it's come a long way. The other word that comes to mind is vulnerability, which has finally gotten a little more positive press, And now I think, when I actually think, because I'm always working with teams and relationships, and this idea of intimacy, like I said, if I break it down, it's intimacy, be willing to reveal myself so that someone can see into me. Yes. Actually, even maybe more critically, I can see into me. And that I actually believe this idea of embracing those disenfranchised parts that we were talking about earlier, most people want to get rid of them, which is, okay, yeah, I'll get to know this part so I can get rid of it. Yes. And it's like, it's actually developing an intimate relationship with that part that I think is most important. And that takes, to me, intimacy is the knowing of another, the knowing of myself. So it's also the knowing of something that I may not like to actually be willing to hold that and hang out with it. There's usually some inherent tension or fear of, whoa, if I get to know my anger, or if I get to know this part of me that feels weak, it's going to overtake me. But it's like, no, if you actually embrace it and get to know it, and, you actually have a chance to, it's not really, it's not, see, I think people then think, oh, I'm going to transform. It's going to be different. But it's like, no, you're intimate with it. It's a part of you. And that's like a way to bring all of you. And if somebody gets caught up in the sex, they could think of it as lovemaking yourself at work, like all of it, not just the parts you think are bad, but like to really embrace and be intimate. And I think the same is true with people on your team. It's not about just figuring out how I can work with this person sometimes. Like if you're going to be spending a lot of time together and you really want to be successful, you want to develop intimacy. You want to actually understand and know that person. You want them to know you for all of who you are. And yeah, if you think of it as only sex, that's going to be problematic. But that's the power side of it. The actual strength is in that.
Let's go to the other side of that for a minute, Susan.
Okay.
So, our listener is listening to this and they go, I agree with you. I think this is important. And I realize I've got to challenge myself to be a little more intimate at work. Okay, great. But now they say, but I got to go talk to John. And John's about as intimate as a stick, right? I mean, John is not willing to open up. And John says, or Betty says, I'm at work. I don't talk about personal things. I don't want you to know about the personal things. I'm just here to do a job. I can be nice to you. You can be nice to me. We can get along, but I don't want to hear about your personal life, and I don't want you to hear about mine. What would you say to somebody like that who's actually genuinely wanting the intimacy, wanting to do better at it, but realizes that they're confronting somebody who they might just say, well, this person's cold or hard, but the truth is that this person might be afraid. How do you bring that to this person?
Well, two things came up when you said it. One, I don't know that intimacy has to be about sharing about my personal life. So it's really about taking whatever is right in front of us and being more real about talking about it. So even with somebody, it's like if someone is saying, hey, I don't want to know about your personal life, it's like, actually, that's not what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to tell you more about, this particular situation right now where like I'm dealing with a lot of people right now that are dealing with layoffs or dealing with headwinds so it's like, take any one of those things. And instead of talking about it up here in the kind of, the world of business, bring it down to, I realize even when I say that, it's difficult for me because I don't have an answer and that's uncomfortable for me. And that's intimacy as well. Talking about the actual real life, that's even more intimate than talking about my life at home. And that I think sometimes someone can hear, as long as you're not demanding they do it, you right. Show up, they may be more interested.
Well, I think you made a very good point because again, this presupposition that intimacy is sexual. Okay, so now we put that to the side. Then the second presupposition is intimacy is, oh my God, I'm going to have to listen to you about your childhood. I don't want to hear that stuff. And I'm certainly not going to tell you about mine. But the intimacy of the experience I'm in is what you're talking about. And yes, I think you're still going to get resistance to that because some people are just resistant. And that's all there is to it. But the intimacy of here's what's going on, even in this environment, this work environment, and it brings up this for me. How is it for you? Well, I'm just here to do a job. Okay. Again, it's not forcing it. But the key thing I want you to understand as you listen, and you've heard me say this many, many times if you're a regular listener, is that if you want to understand what trust is, it's very simple. Trust is reciprocal vulnerability. That's what trust is. Without reciprocal vulnerability, there is no trust. If you think about somebody you've known for 5 years who is a deep, trusted friend, and you think about an acquaintance you've known for 5 years, then it's not time, is it? No. So what's the distinction between these two things? And the answer is reciprocal vulnerability. And now notice the word reciprocal. Reciprocal is not just that I'm vulnerable with you and you're vulnerable with me, but the reciprocity is also in depth. So this is key, and this is why that's a key word in the book of in Susan's book title, depth, right? So it's like, I'm not going to dive into 25 feet and expect you to dive into 25 feet. Maybe you can only go in 2 inches. So I got to go in at 2 inches so I make it safe for you to go in at 2. And then next time I can go in at 3 and you can go in at 3. This relational piece is the crux of what it means to be in a relationship, is in the intimacy. And so when you talked about in the title of the book being this cracked or crazy in order to get to the warmth and the depth, when you say cracked, I want you to define each of those words in the context of the book so people can grasp what this means. Because again, everybody's got their own subjective analysis of a word. So what does each one of those mean for you?
Okay. Well, I mean, if I start off with the crazy, I think, for me, that really came from literally being told when I was young, what you're saying isn't true. And then also realizing at some point I'd lied so much I didn't even know what was true. So it did feel crazy. And
right.
So my crazy is, I was too imaginative. I'm dyslexic. It's not the way people work, all of that. Somebody else's crazy may be, I'm too sensitive. I'm not good enough. I have to be like the guy. I have to be like a man to be in this world. Their crazy may have some variations of that. So I think it is like, what's that part of yourself that you don't want anybody to know about? And do you even know about it? Like, that would be the question.
Right.
Are you? Yeah.
So what have I accepted in my psyche as crazy? What have I given myself as crazy, which in fact, when I look at it, may not be. And, and I want to touch on something you said at the beginning in the first show, because it's part of my belief system, is that your genius is buried in your crazy.
Yeah.
Right? The genius is buried in the crazy. You had all kinds of problems around your ideas around relationship. Crazy. She's crazy. Right?
Yeah.
And now you're the relationship guide in businesses and in relationships. And so the crazy actually was the genius. And I think if you listening put a pin in that, just to ask yourself that, just write that down. What if my crazy is my genius? You might be onto something massive in your life. So crazy for you was you were told that what you were thinking was crazy. You lied to yourself about those things until eventually you didn't know what was crazy or true. Is that correct?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So you get the idea of crazy, and it's, and what helps me now when I use the word I'm crazy, I actually say, wait a minute, I'm sane. And that sort of settles me. And then I can look at that in a different way. I show up differently. I think the brilliance comes out then. Actually, my sanity was my brilliance in some respects. Once I kind of put that together, it helped.
Right.
Cracked an interesting one, because I think of cracked as, when I got the cancer diagnosis, for sure, that was a jolt in my entire system. There's no way I was supposed to be super healthy. I was 22. This was not stage 4 cancer. No. And so that's a big crack, however, that dream was like, I think of how volcanoes, they're under the ground putting cracks out all the time. My dream was a version of those cracks. I wasn't listening to it, but it was there repetitively, now I think of, I talk to people all the time, and it's usually little things like a crisis in the family or some health crisis, or, now we had the pandemic. That's a heck of a big crack. Like, those are kind of monumental cracks. But cracks can also come, when you like, I think of people I know that run and exercise, and I'm always like, I'm encouraging, it's great. That's great for your health. And they use it for anger management. And I'm like, but do you actually ever say anything? Like, do you make sounds? Do you kind of move your body different? And they look at me like, no. And I'm like, try it. And those sort of things are ways to crack, if you're willing to try being, even to try being silly, to try doing something where for a lot of times for adults. I mean, when I worked with kids, they would bring their parents in, and I would talk to them about the idea of having a Vesuvius instead of doing anger in their normal. And I'd have the kids show them, because their parents are like, no way am I doing that. But the kids were like, whoa, I'd love it if you did it. It looks like this, And right. So that's a cracking. That's like gives you permission to crack.
So the spontaneous crack is the warning.
Yeah.
Right. i.e. your dreams. The spontaneous crack is the warning, but you can develop your own cracks to let out the pressure so that you don't get a volcano.
Or to even just begin to allow, if you do something different enough times. I worked with a guy who had seen every medical, this was the head of the executive team guy, and he'd gone to every medical because he was having heart palpitations. And he came to see me, and I just suggested, like, I'm going to suggest a simple thing, I suggested he do some breathing, open mouth breathing, 6, 7 minutes, 8 minutes. I was trying to work him to 8. And he was like, no way can I do that at work. And I was like, okay, well, go in your office, close the door, do whatever you need to do, 8 minutes, and see. And, he did it, and he started to notice shift right away. And what was even more interesting was everyone he worked with noticed, like when he would come out of his office, he was different, and he really hated it. He was really pissed. He did not. And I was like, well, okay, so maybe you'd rather have the heart palpitations, or maybe I get it. That looks better. But what if this is actually a path? And he was having so much trouble with it. I said, well, put it to music that you like, but put on headphones so nobody has to hear. And eventually, though, he got so much positive reinforcement from the people outside of his office that he actually was like, hey, I need to encourage them to do this too. And it became a shift, but it was so interesting to watch him struggle, because often we'll find something that helps to loosen us up, but we don't actually like where the loosening is taking us, because that will often take us to some of our crazy, or this isn't, to operating differently than we have. And that can be scary. But, it's like, okay, start small, just breathing without control, not trying to meditate. Because a lot of times people will go, I got the meditation app, and that's helping me stay calmer. And it's like, I'm not opposed to meditation, but that's not what I mean. I'm like, really breathe.
Well, it's like running. If you're running, Partha Sadhijay was one of my great teachers, said, when do you meditate? And I said, well, in the morning. And he said, any other times? And I go, yeah, if I'm stressed out. And he said, stop. And I said, why? He goes, agitated mind, agitated meditation. I said, what do you mean? He goes, meditation isn't to fix you.
Yeah.
Right? You're using it for the wrong thing. And I said, well, what do I do? He goes, go outside and scream. And here's this, this guy, right? Who's like, exactly. He's like, go outside and have a good scream. I'm like, really? Like, are you pulling my leg? He's like, no. Go outside and scream. Then when you've screamed and you've got it all out, come back and meditate. And I was like, oh my God. And I did it. And of course I didn't want to do it. And I was worried about who was listening. And maybe the neighbors will think I've gone Bissell Meshuggah, I've gone crazy, and guess what? Nobody noticed. And the police never arrived, much to my craziness inside of my head about it. And my meditation got a hell of a lot better. So again, I wasn't using it to fix something. Yes. It was something to do on its own, but I needed that crack, as you just described, in the scream. It was mine. It's not saying that's what to do. So we've got crazy, we've got cracked.
Okay. And warm, for me, warm is just that willingness to get out of your head and into your body in some fashion. Like pay attention to sensation, pay attention to when I'm contracting or expanding, really exploring that willingness to notice, not from your head, but from in your body, your belly, your heart, whatever, anything that's something other than your head. And often, it may not feel warm, but often I do find, like, I think of shame as one of those words. When I feel shame, it's a flooding, a flush. It actually, and I actually personally think shame gets a bit of a bad rap. I think when I feel shame, and I don't want to shame somebody else, but when I actually feel shame, it's a really healthy thing, because I have this moment where I'm flooded with heat, when it's like, oh, what have I done that I don't really want to acknowledge that I did? And I have an incredible opportunity, but it's the warmth of that brings it to the surface.
Just pay attention to that.
Yeah. So pay attention to those sensations more than anything else. And yeah.
Okay. So we've got cracked, crazy, warm.
And then deep. For me, deep is the one where I remember this was actually, I think I mentioned I fractured my family. I brought my family back together for a family conference after 10 years of being separated. We didn't talk to each other. There was nothing. There was, no acknowledgement of anything that had ever happened in my life. And I admit, I kind of had a thought that this would be an opportunity to say my piece and be heard and be acknowledged. But what was amazing about the experience was the moment. It was my mother who was talking, and she didn't believe, she was saying, that's just not what happened. And she started to talk about her own experience of what happened when I had come forward, started to, and as I listened to her, I noticed that all of a sudden I started to have these tears, like, wow. I was like, wow, that is so different. And I didn't worry about my story. I didn't worry about who was right, but I had this deep empathy for her. Like, wow, that must have really screwed you up. Like, what the hell? And I could see her pain. And that moment in that family event stood out to me, because it was where I really got, oh, this isn't about me being right. It's about me being relational, like me connecting to my mom. That was when that's what deep is. It's when I connect outside of my own experience, outside of my own story, maybe to something that's totally against everything I believe. But I have this moment where it's like, whoa, I think I at least have some understanding, and I don't have to fix, change, or convince you, but I just can be with you. And that to me is what warmth is. And it's also what intimacy is. It's like, oh, I don't have to change you to be me. And I can actually appreciate you, even if you're like totally different. And sometimes that's really hard, but
it is really hard. And let's be fair about that to anybody who's listening. It can be extraordinarily difficult. Because, we hear all this superficial, my language, superficial New Age bullshit about forgiveness, rather than what real forgiveness is, which is vastly different. Forgiveness is not, well, I've forgiven my mother. Why? Because you said you have? You never felt anything. I have forgiven my mother. But I had plenty of rage for a long time about it, which I was able to come to terms with, do therapy on, and have conversations with my mother where I could get to the depth that I'm really hearing you talk about. Because I think, again, one of the popular words of our time is empathy. Is empathy important? God, yes, absolutely. But how do you have empathy with somebody who you have no similarity in experience with and no similarity in belief with? People go, oh, I don't know. I don't know. I wasn't raped. How can I get that? But if you can just allow yourself to imagine what it would be like to have that experience, what that might do to you, how that might impact you as a human being, suddenly your story takes a back seat. And that's what I'm loving about what you're saying, Susan, is that your story takes a back seat. And when I say back seat, please understand, I'm not saying it becomes invalid, and I'm not saying it becomes less important. But what Susan just said is so important. It takes a backseat because it's no longer about it being the right truth.
Right.
It is your truth, and that's appropriate, but it's not right. Yeah. It's so am I, and again, I want to put this forward. Susan said it, and I want you to hear it. When you're dealing with your executive team, when you're dealing with co-team, when you're dealing with peers, when you're dealing with people who you lead, do you want to be right or do you want to be relational? Well, I'm in business. I need to be right. Yeah, but you can't actually be right without being relational and have a working situation.
Yeah. I totally get that it's not a simple thing. And one of the biggest pieces is becoming aware of when have I gotten into my righteousness or wrongness? Like that's another thing, they both are the same continuum. And, I've listened to a lot of people say, well, I just have to give in because he's the boss. It's that. And it's like, that's just as bad as being the bully who always has the right idea. Relational is that's a whole different place. It's not about right, wrong right now. It's about us each understanding each other and getting the value or the importance of what somebody is bringing to the table. And that is something that is worth it. You may not end up doing it. You may find out that the right way is something totally different than you ever expected because you suddenly have more to work with,
So as we come to the end of part 2 here of the show, one of the things I really would like for you to share is in the context of this is a leadership show, in the context of people thinking about how do I take this and apply this in a practical manner with my team members and I hope at home, but let's just say it with the team members, up, down, and sideways. What's the practicality here, Susan? What would be the best guidance you could give for somebody to say, go do this in the next 24 hours? What would that be?
Well, I do think probably the biggest thing is really go and begin to explore this idea we talked about the whole time. Like, you're crazy. What is the thing that you actually don't start that process? Start there and think about, even in your own life, the patterns of things that, like mine were pretty big patterns. You have a lot of patterns too, that anyone, look at them and what is the theme for you? Now you can do that yourself. And I can tell you, the minute you start doing that, it's going to start to impact the people around you. And then you have an opportunity to talk about it. So it's not like, okay, take this model and then go into the workplace and, ask your people, where are you, crazy crack Morgan? That would probably be ineffective. But actually start your own exploration. And then as you go, be relational about it, talk about it. Be willing to let people see how that showed up in the workplace, not how it showed up in your childhood. Like those same themes I talked about show up when I go to work, and I can now look at them and see, oh, I'm doing the exact same pattern, and it's not as loud, but it's the same one that wasn't helping me before. And that's actually where I think it can become really valuable, and use it for your own sense of bringing yourself forward more fully. Start there.
Wonderful. I agree with you entirely. Susan, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for all that you've shared. As we come to the close of the show, I'd love for you to once again just tell everybody where they can find out more about the book, about you, about your work, and about your organization.
All right. Well, you could get the book off of Amazon, Crazy, Cracked, Warm and Deep, or Barnes & Noble, any of the independent bookstores as well. And you can find out more about me at www.thriveinc.com, THRIVEINC.com. And we have a podcast and our other books as well that you can learn about there. So
wonderful. So again, of course, we will post all of those links on the show notes. Again, thank you, Susan. It was a pleasure and an honor. For you, dear listener, remember that you can hang out with other conscious leaders. You can chat about this episode or any past episodes inside of our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. And remember that those who control the meaning for the tribe also control the movement of the tribe. You can tap into these groundbreaking understanding of how to apply the anatomy of meaning extracted from your emotional source code to build your business, to grow your business, and to find out how to tap in what drives human behavior. I'm Dov Barron. I'm here to show you, your business, and your team how to harness their emotional source code and move the tribe. Because unified actualized meaning is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about how you can maybe be a little more cracked, a little more crazy, certainly more warm, and go deeper. I'm Dov Barron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.